We're going to be going over the patch 3.9 Conquerors of the Atlas patch notes. But we're going to be focusing in on my personal specialty, bows, because that's what I believe I have the best amount of content to offer here, and let's get straight into it. So to begin with though, I kind of want to go over the premise of patch 3.9. What is going to constitute a good meta build? So in 3.9, we're looking for a build that can both tackle the hardest and most difficult endgame bosses, while also being able to clear maps at a very fast pace. The reason for this is because GGG has combined the new endgame bosses with running an amount of maps. So you're going to have to do a few maps to get the bosses to spawn, then do the boss, and then kind of alternate between that kind of style from what I understand. So to do that, we're going to be looking at a build that can do both bosses and mapping, and which one of the new skills, whether it's new or old or adjusted, will be the best fit for that. So let's get straight into it and let's take a look at the patch notes. To begin with though, I have kind of narrowed it down a little bit here. We do have a bit of a summary of these patch notes because there is a ton of stuff with bows that have changed. Before we get into it though, I do want to say I do believe bows are the best choice for a hybrid character between clear speed and bossing potential. I think you'll be able to get the most awakeners per hour by playing a bow build, and we'll get into the specifics of that right now. So let's start off initially with Shrapnel Shot. So Shrapnel Shot is traditionally not a very used skill. It's kind of used in Act 1 to level up before you get random arrows, and that's about it. So in the new bow rework patch, they're giving it some flat added lightning damage. It looks to be about 1/3 to half of a lightning damage kind of support at level 20. So it's a decent amount of lightning damage. It now scales its area kind of shotgun blast with projectile speed instead of AoE, and it actually also fires 2 additional arrows. So in general, a lot of quality of life there with the projectile speed. You don't have to scale AoE anymore. And you're also getting a nice kind of spread of the arrows as well, allowing you to double up that damage easier than having just one projectile, and kind of allows you to drop off the GMP or LMP that you used to have to use. We're also getting a bit of flatlining damage, but that isn't too relevant at that ultra endgame where you're going to be tackling these endgame bosses. So overall, while Shrapnel Shot will be a very good leveling option, especially early on because you get it very quickly, I don't think it's going to be what you're looking for that clear speed bossing meta. So Shrapnel Shot, try it out while you're leveling, maybe even in early maps, but I think there are better options. Next up, we have the newly adjusted Blast Rain. I'd say this is more of a rework than a adjustment. So overall, Blast Rain used to be a pretty good single target spell. It offers flat penetration for fire damage and also converts 50% of your physical damage to fire damage. And it was decent. It gave you 48% of your base damage effectiveness on each explosion, and it could do up to 5 with the Lab Helmet enchant. So now they're turning down the damage per explosion a little bit, but they're allowing additional projectiles to kind of give you more explosions, which is pretty damn insane. Anytime that they add an additional kind of axis for a skill to scale, it's a really big deal. So in this case, we're losing a bit of damage effectiveness per explosion for that potential. But GGG is making up for that slightly by adding an additional blast to the base kind of skill. So we go from 4, which is 5 with the Helmet enchant, up to 6 with the Helmet enchant, which is definitely not bad. Overall, you're going to net a pretty even kind of result, and as soon as you start adding additional projectiles in from Dying Sun, from stuff like Death's Opus or the Deadeye Ascendancy, you're going to see the skill do a lot more damage than it ever did before. Quite considerable amounts more, in fact. I can easily see you getting up to like 10 explosions with an Arborix or something like that, and that is a lot of damage indeed. That's like 500% of your base damage pretty much, or not quite that much anymore because they nerfed it down, but definitely still a pretty sizable amount of damage. So Blast Rain overall, I could see some people going for this for a single target option, especially if you can scale a number of projectiles with it. So definitely an interesting option to try out, whether that's on totems like the new ballistas or just by yourself. Next up we have Ice Shot. Ice Shot is a bit of a fan favorite. Most people really love Ice Shot. So overall, it's still a very good clear skill, and it has kind of some new interactions with the newly reworked chill, and you can basically expect Ice Shot to do big chills even on bosses now, with the potential to freeze them, which will be particularly powerful against some map bosses if you have high enough damage. Now, Ice Shot, while it's a good clear skill, has never really been a very good single target skill without the help of something like Void Fletcher. Now, we'll talk about Void Fletcher after we get through all the skills, but overall, Ice Shot is going to be kind of like half of the equation. You'll want Ice Shot plus something else, and the buffs, unfortunately, aren't going to do anything to change that. You can attach something like the new Barrage support to it, but I believe that you'll still need 2 Ice Shot setups for that scenario as well. So while Ice Shot is good, it's just been increased for its clearing potential overall. Next up in a similar boat is Lightning Arrow. Lightning Arrow is a bit of a different one though. It's getting a little bit of a buff from the damage here, not as much as Ice Shot. It's definitely a lot further behind in terms of the amount of raw damage it can do to one target. But of course, Ice Shot can shotgun things quite well, so it's going to be a very powerful clear skill, again similar to Ice Shot, but I don't expect it to be doing much single target damage due to the fact that it's just not built for that. It doesn't scale very well with projectiles, and the penalties that come with the barrage support just aren't worth it in my opinion. So both of these skills are pretty similar, kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum of Blast Rain. Blast Rain is very single target, whereas Ice Shot and Lightning Arrow are definitely ones you'd want to have for AoE, and you can kind of pair them together to kind of make a very powerful character, but they're not standalone skills that you can kind of just set one and forget, even with these buffs. Next up, we have Rain of Arrows. So Rain of Arrows is a one that is potentially a kind of one-size-fits-all skill. They're increasing its base damage by 20%, which is very, very powerful. It was already a very strong skill, both on the damage kind of wise side of things, as well as kind of the clearing side of things. So it definitely did have potential to kind of like, fill both slots. You may need to use a few gem swaps, like swapping AoE for Conk Effect and stuff like that, but it is significantly more powerful now, which is pretty damn good. So Rain of Arrows is definitely a pretty good one here. Got it mixed up a little bit here with Scourge Arrow. But yeah, very, very, very strong. And this will also assumingly apply to Vile Rain of Arrows as well. And the combination of those are pretty good, giving you very good burst damage on the bosses in maps as well as clear. Now, it doesn't scale very well into the very ultra late game like Blast Rain does, or something like Barrage, due to the fact that it doesn't really get much benefit from additional projectiles, and that's kind of the main way you get massive damage multipliers on your bow attacks. And it also doesn't synergize very well with Void Fletcher, which is going to be a very hot topic this late in my opinion. Void Fletcher is definitely something that synergizes very well with all of the skills above, maybe not Shrapnel Shot, but these guys, anyone that benefits from having additional projectiles is going to want to use Void Fletcher, and Rain of Arrows doesn't really care about additional projectiles, unfortunately, so it's kind of like a mid-tier skill. It's probably one of the most powerful mid-tier skills. Like, it's kind of like your in-between point. You might get through the act, you want to use Rain of Arrows, and then later on transition into something else, maybe like a Blast Rain Ice Shot setup or something like that. But for the ultra late game and you're kind of farming it out, it's probably not the best choice, but a very good mid-tier choice. Next up, we have the former DPS king, Scourge Arrow, taking a absolutely massive nerf, which is just insane. They didn't mention anything about nerfing Scourge Arrow, but here they are, absolutely attacking it with a massive axe. It's definitely a very, very sizable nerf. It's about 15% off, straight off the effectiveness. So it's nothing. It's probably about like a 33% nerf or something like that overall. Maybe a little bit less than that, like 30%. But that's definitely a lot of damage lost. So overall, it's about 30% less damage for Scourge Arrow, which is pretty crazy. So if you were doing 1 million, you're now doing 660,000 or something like that, which is pretty crazy, especially when we get to the rest of the bow adjustments. So yeah, Scourge Arrow definitely down, but definitely not out. It's probably still the strongest single target ability. Maybe it kind of can be like destroyed a little bit by Barrage or Tornado Shot, but I would definitely probably rank it as number 1 still as DPS goes, single target purely. if you can time all of the stuff perfectly. So while it's down, it's definitely not out, and it is, again, like Rain of Arrows, one of those skills which you can kind of use it for everything. It might not be the best for clearing, but I definitely do think that it is a massive beast for single targets still, and it is actually an ultra late game kind of viable skill. So I would definitely look into using Scourge Arrow in your endgame setups, or putting it on some of those ballistas if you want to try that out. It kind of takes a lot of the annoying parts of Scourge Arrow out of it, because it kind of charges it up and fires them all for you, which is pretty interesting. So Scourge Arrow, definitely a top contender there, and we'll tie it all up with our final one here for the pure bow skills, and that is Tornado Shot. So everyone's saying Tornado Shot is finally dead. Oh yes, it's gone. But I am here to tell you I don't think that's the case. So what did they change with Tornado Shot? So the only change to Tornado Shot was that secondary projectiles now fade over time, similar to Freezing Pulse. And it's kind of a quote as well. They specifically mention Freezing Pulse. So most people are kind of thinking, okay, so they're not going to have like that much AoE anymore. You're not going to be able to off-screen things, full-screen things, or anything like that. Before we get into that specifically, I do quickly want to compare Tornado Shot to the other skills on this list. So Scourge Arrow is definitely a cut above the rest of the skills on the list in terms of single target and how it mechanically works. It just has unmatched scaling. Nothing even comes really close to the amount of raw damage you can get out of Scourge Arrow as a standalone skill. Having said that though, Scourge Arrow doesn't synergize very well with Void Fletcher, which I'll talk about in a second, but in terms of like raw numbers, I still think Scourge Arrow is the best. Tornado Shot, however, does scale similarly to Blast Rain with its additional projectiles. Each additional projectile will give you, in theory, another 100% damage effectiveness of your base damage, which is pretty insane. And those are the skills which are kind of like the hybrid skills. And it still retains, in my opinion, its full screen AoE clear ability as well. And I'm going to kind of show you guys what I mean right now. So Freezing Pulse specifically mentioned, let's take a look at what Freezing Pulse looks like in game. So, Freezing Pulse, if you guys didn't know, traditionally probably reaches, you shoot it out and it probably reaches to about here and will pierce through all of its enemies. But it is modified by projectile speed, and projectile speed will allow the projectile to move further before it despawns. So basically what that means is with enough projectile speed, you can kind of make it go way off the screen. And right now I've decided to take all the projectile speed on the tree, which is like kind of close to you. The only node I don't have is the duelist node. Everything else I have, and it's pretty easy to get to as well. I think I only spent an additional like 5 points. And then you also pick up the 30% from Deadeye. And this is kind of what the projectile speed looks like with a direct comparison to Freezing Pulse, which was made. And that is that there. It goes all the way off the screen. So if that's kind of what we're comparing it to, Tornado Shot is completely fine. The secondary projectiles are still going to fly way off the screen. And the only question is how that interacts with chain and fork and stuff like that. But I'm not worried at all. They haven't touched the damage effectiveness or the damage kind of like shotgunning of Tornado Shot. So it still remains the best clear skill in my opinion. It still remains probably one of the best single target abilities in the game, just behind Scourge Arrow, and maybe Blast Rain, depending on how the scaling works with the fire penetration and stuff like that. But it's definitely on the top 3 single target kind of spells for bows in general. So I would almost rate it number 1, due to the fact that it can utilize Void Fletcher far better than Scourge Arrow does, and it's kind of multi-utility, which Blast Rain is not. Blast Rain is definitely a very much single target skill, and here is the thing that I've been talking about all this time, Void Fletcher. So Void Fletcher is a quiver that drops off of Uberelda, kind of an expensive item, but this, in my opinion, is going to be the backbone of a lot of the boss killing bow builds in the new league. So this quiver basically allows you to fire a bunch of projectiles every time you shoot your bow, and they can shotgun and they scale with projectiles. So the more projectiles you have, the more explosions you have, and the more they shotgun. And these things do about 220% of your base damage, which is quite a lot, and you'll notice that bosses, after these things start going off, just explode. And I can kind of show you guys what it looks like here. So you can see here, that's just with 2 projectiles, 1 base and then 1 from Deadeye. But imagine all of those overlapping and kind of just all doing a massive chunk of damage. Now try and imagine that with Scourger, it wouldn't work out too well because you only shoot 1 shot every like 1 and 1.5 seconds. And then with Blast Rain, it's kind of a bit awkward as well. But with Tornado Shot, you can retain that off-screen clearing with Chain and Fork if you want. And you can also have insane boss damage with this quiver, assuming you scale it correctly. So overall, what is my assessment for the pure bow skills here? I believe that Blast Rain will make a strong single target ability, but probably falls short behind Scourger and Tornado Shot in terms of the single target department still. I believe Rain of Arrows is going to be a fantastic kind of intermittent mid-tier skill which you can use to kind of get that gear going and then transition into either Scourge Arrow, Tornado Shot, or some sort of a hybrid using Ice Shot, Lightning Arrow, and some other single target ability. And then of course we have Scourge Arrow, a very strong single target kind of hybrid clear skill. And then we have of course Tornado Shot, which I believe is still going to be the best skill by far, pending any crazy things with the projectile speed that we don't know about. And in combination with the Void Fletcher quiver, I believe will just be insane clear speed and single target damage. So that's going to be the bow skills. I've left a few out here due to the fact that they're kind of very mechanically different and they require specific builds that build around them like in itself. So you've got stuff like Burning Arrow, Caustic Arrow, and Elemental Hit, as well as Toxic Rain, all very, very different skills which require their own build. So we're not going to be talking any more about those, even though many of them did get buffed. So next up, I just kind of quickly want to go over the item changes that were made and kind of make a few comments. So Point Blank was nerfed by almost half. That's a massive damage hit to many builds, unfortunately. But I think it's fine. Bow damage was already in the multi-millions, and with Void Fletcher, it's completely not an issue. Many builds weren't even running Point Blank due to the kind of risky nature of the Keystone. In many fights, you had to get right up next to the boss to make it worth it. Otherwise, you'd be losing damage while carting around. So while it's definitely a hit, many people weren't using it anyway, so you don't really need it, but if you're going for some crazy massive damage juicing build, maybe it will affect you. If you're going for like POB warrior kind of numbers, you're definitely going to notice this hit. Next up, one that you definitely are going to feel is that you can no longer craft ailments and increase damage. So that's this stat here on my bow, the 73% cold and 21% chance to freeze. That's gone, deleted from the game, as well as the penetration on my bow has been nerfed from 14 to 16 down to 9 to 10, which is a pretty big hit. In addition to that, you can no longer multi-mod more than 2 mods onto a bow. So you sacrifice 1 mod to put the multi-mod on, and all that's going to net you is an additional crafted modifier, so taking it from 1 to 2, which is a massive nerf to pretty much all multi-modded kind of weapons. And it will definitely dissuade a lot of people from using it. The best way to use multi-mod now is to get a rare item with 3 affixes on it, then multi-mod it and put the final 2 on, which is definitely a lot more difficult. Next up, we also have more nerfs to rare items. We have physical kind of damage builds taking a massive hit from the additional elemental as extra damage. That's been nerfed, as well as double damage being completely gutted. That's another stat on my bow here. We can see the 20% chance to deal double damage has been reduced to 4 to 6, which is completely insane. That nerf is over half of the double damage gone, which is definitely pretty crazy. In addition to that, they also nerfed the last mod on this bow, which was the dexterity kind of stacking cold effect on this bow here. So they actually nerfed pretty much every single mod on the bow that I'm using by mostly all of it. A lot of it has just been reduced to like the double damage has been completely destroyed. The cold damage has been reduced by about 25%. You know, we get the point here. They also nerfed some other elemental kind of crafts on like amulets, but we're not going to get too much into that. So yeah, big nerfs across the board on crafted bows and amulets, and all kind of elemental gear has been hit, which is pretty crazy, and definitely a massive nerf to bows overall at the top end. So if you were going for mirror gear, you're definitely going to feel this one. Next up, they also nerfed Hiri's Aya by about, I think, 25 to 30% as well. So that's going to take a hit. Still an excellent chest piece, but it brings it kind of a little bit more in line with stuff like Shroud of the Lightless and Farrell's Fur for pure bossing. So it's not going to be a complete no-brainer anymore to put on Hiri's Aya, but we'll have to see how that all works out and kind of how the new fights look, whether Farrell's Fur is worth it. And that's kind of all I've got for you guys in terms of the gear department and the patch notes for bows specifically. So you guys are going to kind of like see how my builds come together over the next few days. I'll be posting a path of building, but a lot of it is going to be focusing on the Void Fletcher Quiver, which I understand will be quite an expensive item, but I do honestly believe it is the way forward for a kind of hybrid approach, getting those massive numbers with that quiver, as well as kind of juicing up a tornado shot or a Scourge arrow if you're kind of going down that route without the quiver. I think those are going to be probably the best options, even despite the nerfs. In terms of a bow, we're going to have to figure out something new to craft, but in the meantime, I would recommend using probably something like Death's Opus or the Tempest. So that's all I got for you guys today. Hopefully you guys have enjoyed my little bow review of the new patch notes, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.